Buongiorno. Good afternoon. I'm Karen Schinner, the Press and Cultural Consul here at the U.S. Consulate General in Naples. Italy has always looked with interest at U.S. elections, given our shared value in democracy, but also because of the long-standing friendship between our two countries. Increasingly, we also see a growing interest by young voters in this year's election, both in the United States and here in Italy. That is why we are very pleased to welcome all of you to this joint virtual program with the U.S. Consulate General in Milan on the upcoming U.S. presidential election and other elections in November, the use of communication strategies and technologies, particularly in a time of COVID-19 pandemic, which has further changed the traditional campaign instruments. Joining us today in the virtual audience are a number of alumni of U.S. government exchange programs and the following universities we would like to recognize and acknowledge for their ongoing cooperation and partnership: Bocconi University, the University of Catania, the University of Gorizia, Milan Catholic University, ISPI Master Program in Diplomacy, Core University of Enna, the University of Milan, the University of Salento, the University of Salerno, and the University of Turin. And now I am pleased to introduce to you all Kristen Soltis Anderson, writer, journalist, co-founder of Echelon Insights, who is recognized as an expert on millennials, as well as an advocate for women empowerment and equal opportunity. Following her presentation, please note in the YouTube chat to enter your questions in, and you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions during the presentation, and please make sure you write your name and what city you're currently in. And following the presentation, I will moderate the questions and read them aloud so everybody can hear them. Okay. We want to give a warm welcome to Kristen and grazie a tutti for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to have a chance to speak to you today, given that we've got this incredibly exciting election coming up here in the US in just a couple of months that's happening in a moment of incredible turmoil in terms of lots of change, plenty of technological changes, as well as changes that are arising as a result of the pandemic. So I'll go ahead and begin my presentation first by, I want to demonstrate for all of you just how rapidly things still seem to be changing here in the US context. At the end of May, May 24th, this was the front page of the New York Times. It showed that there were 100,000 Americans who had passed away as a result of COVID-19, the front page highlighting about 1,000 of those who had passed away. And yet a week later, we were experiencing brand new types of turmoil as Americans took to the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis. On this front page, just a week later, COVID-19 was nowhere to be found, that the focus was instead on the unrest and the protests. So things are still very fluid, moving an awful lot. And I say that in some ways to say that I think there are some things that COVID might change for now, and there are some things that COVID might change permanently. But because things are so fluid, some of this will be educated guessing. Some of this will be based on what we know at the moment. But a week from now, a new story could have popped up. There could be big change that is leading us to think about politics in a brand new way. So all of this is coming with a little bit of a note of caution. But I am going to try to walk you through the things that I think are changing that will be at least short-term changes, but that might not stick around for future elections, versus some of the things that I think this COVID-19 moment is going to change permanently about American politics. So I'll start off by talking about digital and TV media, the way that so many campaigns and candidates communicate with their voters. Now, in the US, this shift to using digital campaigning was well underway long before COVID-19 came on the scene. We have stories from Axios talking about how money is still pouring into election ads. The digital advertising was at 1.8 billion was what is expected, a huge increase over what was spent in terms of digital advertising in campaigns as recently as the 2012 election. And a Politico article from just this past month sort of noted that political ads are going to continue to be something folks are spending on, that even in COVID-19, when lots of traditional advertisers, brand marketers are pulling back on some of their ad spending, that political advertising is not likely to go anywhere, and that digital ad spending, which was already on the rise, is likely to continue to do so. And you've seen social media sort of spreading further engagement in critical political and cultural issues. Just this past week, we had Blackout Tuesday, where folks around the world, not just in the US, used the hashtag Blackout Tuesday and posted black squares on their social media accounts, kind of to stand in solidarity with protesters from Black Lives Matter, from the movement, those who are protesting against police brutality. And this was controversial. Not everyone who was an activist felt that this was a good way to engage folks, but nonetheless, you had millions of those around the world participating in this way. Now, a big question is, does this type of engagement actually lead to changes in elections? Does it make people engage further? Does it get them to go to the polls? And I believe it does. We saw a real big rise in social media engagement in politics on the part of many young people here in the US after the 2016 election. You had causes like the Women's March. You had things like the March for Our Lives movement around pushing back against gun rights measures. You had a lot of these debates sort of happening on social media. But in the end, I believe it did lead to increases in young people participating in the process. This is some data from the Pew Research Center looking at midterm elections. So midterm elections are the elections we have here in the US every 2 years. And typically we use the phrase midterm to define those that are happening when a presidential election is not also happening. So you'll have senators up for re-election, you'll have members of the House of Representatives up for re-election. Many states, it's when they choose their governor, but there's no presidential vote on the ballot. And as a result, turnout tends to be lower in those elections. But we can see if we look over time, the percentage of votes that are cast by those in the millennial generation went up dramatically, went from close to 20% in the 2014 midterms all the way to 42%, doubling from just midterm to midterm. You also saw that Generation Z, those who were born roughly around 1996 or later, they're beginning their participation as of those 2018 midterms in the US, and their participation is beginning at 30% turnout. Now, 30% turnout may not seem like a lot. I know there are many countries around the world where voter turnout tends to be much, much higher. But here in the US, for young voters, 30% turnout in a midterm election is actually fairly high. And so I think it bodes well for the prospect that young people may have gotten more interested in politics, that politics became more pervasive in their lives as a result of it being featured more and more on social media, where they spend much of their time and attention. But that did, in the end, translate to many of them feeling more engaged in the process, feeling like they had something at stake, and deciding to participate in the election. Now, digital is also going to be substituting for a lot of things that used to happen in person. We know that the big campaign rallies that President Trump holds are some of his favorite things that he does when he's running for office. Both Democrats and Republicans typically have in-person political conventions during the summer. At the moment, the Trump campaign is trying to find ways to use digital to substitute. A really excellent Axios article from a couple of weeks ago notes that the Trump campaign is now planning to do online broadcasts to its supporters, that the rallies that used to be the center of the campaign, certainly there have been news stories that those are potentially going to be coming back soon. And given that you saw so many folks take to the streets in fairly close quarters for protests around the Black Lives Matter movement over the last few weeks, there is increasing agitation, I think, among Republicans to say, look, if you can have those protests, you should be able to have political rallies. President Trump sort of pushing to want to do that more. But in the meantime, many campaigns have been switching to increased digital live events. You've also seen this with Joe Biden doing live events with folks like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, trying to use live streams to substitute for what would have normally been packed arenas. Now, in particular, in our elections, we're seeing Republicans seem to be a little more eager to get back to traditional campaigning, again, in part because President Trump loves holding those rallies so much. But this is some polling that was done by my firm, Echelon Insights, last month, where we asked people, in your opinion, should the government restrict the following activities to try to curb the coronavirus? And we found that while there are lots of things that Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say, please bring these back, we don't think the government should be regulating them. On the question of attending concerts, live sporting events, or other large gatherings, that's still something where only a quarter of Republicans felt like that should not be restricted. So slightly more comfort among Republicans, but still a lot of folks very apprehensive about what these in-person events would look like. Now, the other thing that tended to happen in person in American campaigns was folks could go to their local campaign headquarters and volunteer. They could help make phone calls. They could help reach out to those in their community. They could pick up lists of those whose doors they could knock on. And that's obviously become much more complicated in the COVID-19 era. So we now have campaigns that are increasingly trying to build online ecosystems where folks can go and do things like earn points. You can earn points for going on and saying, hey, I've contacted 10 of my friends. There are activities you can do that are not the same as what you might do going to a campaign headquarters, but still want to give volunteers and supporters that sense of being connected, even when they can't be connected in person. And what this has done is, I think, supercharged this focus on circumventing traditional media and traditional means of communication. In the not too distant past, a main way campaigns would get their message out would be to go do interviews on television programs. They would go do an interview with somebody like Oprah, or they would go on a major national news program. And increasingly, campaigns are moving away from that into trying to have communication that speaks directly to their supporters that they control entirely. So there's an image here of something that the Trump campaign is trying. They're trying something that they call The Right View, which is a television show that they are producing entirely in-house that is supposed to be a Republican-only version of the television show The View, which is folks of lots of different views come on that show. This is trying to be a sort of Trump-centric version of that program. I think this is the sort of thing you're going to see more and more of, and I don't think it's just as a result of the pandemic. While certainly the need for more digital media has increased during the pandemic, I don't think this is the sort of thing that goes away afterwards. However, it's important to note that things like this, I think, are very good for reaching your supporters. Someone who decides, you know what I want to do with my Thursday afternoon? I want to sit down and I want to watch the Trump campaign have a television show. That's not necessarily the types of folks who are persuadable voters. If you already liked Joe Biden or you already like Donald Trump, you may be eager to spend your afternoon signing up to watch one of these live streams. But if you're someone who is a swing voter, you may not be as engaged, and you certainly aren't as likely to want to sign up to watch something that seems like it might just be one-sided. So I think that while campaigns are going to turn to this more and more as a way to message to and engage their supporters, it still won't replace fully the need to engage with traditional media to reach those swing voters. Another thing that has changed as a result of COVID-19 is, I think, an importance on things like video games. So we saw early on in the crisis, when folks could no longer leave their homes, no longer go engage in traditional recreation, that video games became more and more prevalent. Now, things like watching esports are not replacing pro sports entirely here in the US, but you do have things like the game Animal Crossing, which has become very popular on the Nintendo Switch platform that debuted just at the start of the pandemic. We're seeing some politicians and some Hollywood celebrities engage with their fans and supporters by going into Animal Crossing and traveling to people's fictional islands within the game. So these are some of the more unusual and creative ways that some politicians are using technology to try to engage with people during this pandemic. Now, another trend that I think is going to continue is the decline in importance of party conventions. Now, long before COVID 19 threatened the ability of Democrats to have their convention in Milwaukee or Republicans to have their convention in Charlotte, we saw that the television ratings themselves for the conventions were falling consistently. And this, again, this is not adjusted for the growth in population. Even as more and more Americans got televisions or were able to watch these on TV, fewer and fewer were doing so. In 2016, I was a contributor to ABC News, and I went to Philadelphia with them for the convention. And because of the way the convention schedule worked out, there was one of the nights when they didn't need me to be there. So I got to go back to my hotel and turned on ABC because I wanted to watch the coverage of the convention. And what I wound up seeing for the first couple of minutes before the convention came on was a popular reality TV show, The Bachelorette. And I joked with my friends, I said, I wonder what people watched more, the convention or the reality TV show. And sure enough, when I look and dug up the numbers, more Americans were watching the reality TV show on ABC that night. About 2 million, a little around over 2 million of them dropped off once the convention activities started. So if traditional party conventions are less important, what does that mean for COVID-19? Well, we've already heard that Democrats have plans to scale back a lot of their in-person events, perhaps just having some kind of big spectacle around the speech that Joe Biden will give and whoever his vice presidential nominee is. Republicans, meanwhile, have now been talking about splitting up their events. While things will happen in Charlotte that will be a bit more off the radar, and then they'll try to have something that will look more like a conventional convention in Jacksonville, Florida, where the laws are a little bit more permissive about what types of gatherings can be held. But nonetheless, I think the decline in importance of the party convention itself in a very crowded media environment will continue. Another thing COVID-19 is changing about this election is the loss of certain TV ad opportunities. So television advertising is a huge, huge, huge expense for campaigns here in the US. And in particular, in an era when DVRs let people, you can watch a TV show, but you can record it, you can fast forward through television ads. The biggest places you can put your ads are during live sporting events. Nobody wants to wait to see how a football match turns out. People want to watch it live, and it means that they're less likely to fast forward through the TV ads. Now, in the COVID-19 era, here in the US, the National Football League has not yet really said what their plans will be. Major League Baseball and the Basketball League are not having games at the moment, and they're still in discussions about if and how their seasons will come back. So the loss of live television ad opportunities has really reshaped that landscape, and I think is going to make it a little more challenging for campaigns to be able to get their message across, because there will be so much competition for ad time if any of these live sporting events do come back. Finally, on the digital and TV media space, I think something that's important to note is there's now a lot of pressure on these social media platforms to play a more aggressive role in moderating the content that is on their platforms. And you've had Twitter and Facebook take different approaches to this, which has gotten them in hot water with different parts of the political spectrum. So Twitter most recently got into a little bit of hot water with Republicans for its decision to begin either hiding or fact-checking tweets coming from the president. There were calls outright to just kick Trump off the platform. Twitter resisted those calls. But now the argument coming from many conservatives in the US is that if Twitter is going to fact check the president's tweets or hide things that it thinks are wrong, does that mean anything it leaves up is by definition considered accurate or correct? A lot of conservatives, for instance, criticized, you can see that example there, that there are folks sort of pushing Chinese propaganda or misinformation on the platform. Why would President Trump's get criticized but not that? That's created, I think, a bit of a hot water or a tough situation for Twitter. On the other hand, Facebook is facing pressure from progressives because Facebook takes a much more hands-off approach, does not pull down content, etc. There have even been some Facebook employees within the company that have come out and said they think the way that the company is handling this has been wrong. So continue to watch to see how the different social media platforms navigate the world of moderating content, not just that comes from outside bots or those wishing to drive misinformation, but political leaders themselves whose speech in the US is constitutionally protected. But nonetheless, private platforms have a right to do with their own platform what they see fit, how that tension gets resolved. So, what do I think is likely to stay? I think things like the diminishing importance of political conventions will continue. Outside of the big speeches, just getting everybody together in a room and spending 3 days with lots and lots of folks talking about things, I think is going to be less important. But I do think that live rallies are not going to be gone for long. They're too important to President Trump. They're too important to the way our democracy works. You've already, again, seen folks going into the streets and protesting police brutality and racial injustice, even if it means standing less than 6 feet away from one another. So I don't think live rallies are gone for long. I also think that campaigns are going to continue to move toward creating these independent ecosystems for communicating, but that this is something that's going to be better aimed at engaging people who already support you rather than persuading those who might be on the fence. But TV advertising is still not dead, even as digital becomes very important. That at some point live sports will come back, and that remains an incredibly valuable avenue for campaigns to communicate. But now let's talk about organizing and voting and how COVID-19 has changed some of that. So at the moment, door-to-door campaigning is a bit on hold. We have folks that are now sort of more apprehensive about going and knocking on a stranger's door, et cetera. And I expect that to continue to somewhat be the case. But door-to-door campaigning remains one of the most cost-efficient things that American campaigns do. The amount of money you spend versus the amount of potential new voters you get, folks getting registered, folks getting activated or persuaded, that trade-off is still very valuable and important. So I think that while door-to-door is on hold for now, you will see that come back as we get closer to the fall. The other big change that we're seeing in terms of organizing and voting is a push to conduct elections by mail. Just yesterday in the state of Georgia, there were very highly publicized incidents of extremely long lines at polling places, particularly in counties that are either Democratic strongholds, et cetera. The debate now is what caused that. Was it something caused at the state level by Republicans? Was it something that was caused at the county level by mismanagement? There are folks trying to get to the bottom of that at the moment, but clearly you don't want to have an election where people are having to stand in lines for unbelievable amount of times to cast their vote. So one of the proposed solutions would be to increase voting by mail, something that different states across the country here in the US handle differently. In general, it is Republicans who are the most reluctant to embrace vote by mail. They tend to think that it increases the odds of voter fraud, while for Democrats, they believe that it's a useful and important way to engage folks and make sure that they are able to turn out. But interestingly, that partisan divide is actually much smaller in places that already have vote by mail. If you are a Republican who lives in a state that does not currently have it, you tend to look at it more skeptically. But if you are a Republican who lives in a state that already has a lot of vote by mail, you tend to be a little bit more comfortable with it and have seen that it can work out well when utilized appropriately. So I expect that in places that implement new vote by mail measures, that those will stick around even after COVID-19 goes away if voters decide that they think it is a credible and easy way to make sure that more people can participate in the process. So again, likely to stay after COVID-19. I think if vote by mail does get implemented more places, it won't just be temporary, but that door-to-door get out the vote efforts will come back sooner rather than later as a valuable way to reach voters. So last but not least, I want to touch on polling briefly, which is another thing that has been affected very slightly by COVID-19. So over the course of the last couple of decades, phone poll response rates have fallen in the US. While I know phone polling is not terribly common across the world, in the US for quite a long time, it was the main way that we conducted polls to find out how elections might go. And back in the late 1990s, about a third of households would pick up the phone when called and would take a poll. But progressively over that next 15 years or so, polling response rates really fell off. More and more folks got cell phones or technology that let them screen calls from phone numbers they didn't know. And that led to fewer and fewer people taking telephone polls. Now, when you wind up taking a look nowadays at only 6% of people taking phone polls, that seems pretty terrible. However, there is also a lot of evidence that says that even though folks are now more likely to screen phone calls and not take calls from numbers they don't know, that some of that dynamic has been changed as a result of the pandemic. That now that folks are stuck in their homes, they are more likely to pick up a call from a number they don't know, and they're more likely to take time actually talking to a pollster about their views. Now, I don't think that this will permanently change the fact that phone polling is becoming obsolete in the US, but it has given pollsters a little bit of a reprieve as those response rates have temporarily ticked back up. Now, the other thing that I think is going to make polls better in 2020 is that the polling industry really took a hard look at why the polls got things wrong in 2016. Now, there was a big perception that the polls had missed in a very big way. And actually, the national polls in the 2016 election were pretty close. They showed that it was going to be a closely fought race, if showing that Hillary Clinton would likely to have a couple of points advantage. And in terms of the national popular vote, Hillary Clinton did get more votes. But our system is based on the Electoral College, meaning individual states are what matters most when it comes to choosing our president. And here the polls did get it wrong. There were a number of key states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, et cetera, where the polls underestimated Donald Trump's support. So the polling industry took a look at why that was the case. And they found a couple of different things were the factors that made that so. One was they say there was late changing voters, that folks that had been undecided made up their mind in that last week of the campaign, and it was hard for polls to pick up on it. That's going to be something that will be hard for polls to do better at in the future, because there is a certain cutoff point at which you can't conduct and release new information. It would just require you being too hasty about it. So that will still remain something to be cautious about. But look at the direction that the polls are trending to give you a sense of if late movement is a real thing. The biggest thing that I think has been a big driver, and something that my firm has taken very seriously, is the overrepresentation of college graduates. Now, when I am conducting a poll, I'm trying to make sure that I've got a good balance of voters who represent demographically what the electorate looks like in our country. And that means making sure you have the right balance of race, gender, ethnicity, age, etc. Previously, whether someone had a college degree or not was not a huge factor in how they voted. In the same way that if you are right-handed versus being left-handed, that doesn't necessarily affect how you vote in an election. Previously, if you had a bachelor's degree, a four-year college degree or not, wasn't a huge factor. But in 2016, it was. And so if polls were counting too many people that had college degrees, that was a problem. And surely we look at the data and we see people with college degrees are more likely to take polls. So pollsters nowadays are trying to make sure they have that balance right. And hopefully that will prevent an undercounting of Trump vote from happening again in the future. So what's likely to stay? I think we are likely to see an increased use of digital research tools. Right now, a lot of the tools available to pollsters, things like focus groups, et cetera, you can't do them as much. So I think that shift to online polling is going to continue. And what's likely to go back is those lower phone response rates will kick back in, and pollsters will have to move to online voting. So in conclusion, COVID-19 has accelerated some changes that were already underway in American politics. But as we adapt to this new normal, I think there are a lot of fundamentals of American politics that will remain. So with that, I want to thank you all very much, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Kristen. It looks like we have one question submitted. I just want to remind everybody, please submit your questions, and don't forget to mention what city you're in. So we have a question from Marta Lauro, who is in Naples, and she would like your opinion on how social media can have an impact on voter abstention. So when people choose not to vote. I guess for myself, I'm particularly thinking like there's the huge campaign in the United States for Get Out the Vote.
I think that's a great question. And Marta, thank you so much for asking it. I think social media is something that provides an additional reminder to folks about the importance of voting, about when the election is, et cetera. It gives people another tool to communicate that. And it also, I think, allows people to have an opportunity to make voting seem cool, as silly as that may sound. I wrote a book that was called The Selfie Vote, and it came out in 2015. And at the time, something that was somewhat controversial was, people were taking selfies and posting them on social media, but there were some states in the US where it was illegal to take a photo inside of a voting booth. So some people wanted to post a selfie of them, showing that they had voted, but that was illegal. So I think some of the laws have changed since then. But on election day, now another way that people can remind their friends to vote is by going to vote themselves and taking a photo with their sticker that says, I voted, We tend to give out stickers at our polling places here in the US. The other thing you can do is if you're mailing back in an absentee ballot, you can, show that on social media. And we know that peer pressure and seeing that other people are doing things can be really motivational. That feeling a sense that you need to prove to those around you that you are engaged sort of raises that social pressure to be civically engaged. So while on the one hand, there may be a temptation to say, well, if folks can post about it on social media, that doesn't turn into a vote all the time. Is there slacktivism where people can no longer engage in actual politics? They can just post a quote on their Facebook page and then walk away. That's certainly a risk. But I think what we saw with that data from the midterm elections is that folks, when we see this increase in political activity on social media, particularly among young people, that's not depressing turnout. It's actually helping to increase it by making the importance of politics more pervasive in their everyday lives.
Thanks. And another question related how you were discussing that TV ads are such a huge part, particularly in the United States. So Vincenzo Galasso, who's from the Bocconi University in Milan, he is asking about if COVID-19 and what you've been discussing today will have a negative, how will that impact the negative ad campaigning that we often see?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Vincenzo. This is, I think, a moment where Americans are very frustrated. And you would think that at this moment, they are not looking for something negative. On the other hand, voters will always tell pollsters like me that they don't like negative ads, that they think negative ads are bad and they wish there were less of them. And yet, oftentimes when I go do research after an election, and I ask people what they remember, what things they thought about the candidates, the things that stick in people's minds are the things they remember from these negative ads. So the reality is, I think you're still going to see quite a bit of negative advertising. There was a really exciting new study that just came out yesterday here in the US that did an experiment on what moves people's votes the most. Is it positive ads or negative ads? And is it positive ads about Trump or Biden? Does it matter which candidate it was about? And what it wound up showing was that the biggest effects were around ads that were about Biden, positive and negative, sort of suggesting that the Biden campaign's best strategy would be not to tell people negative things about Trump, because everybody already has an opinion about President Trump one way or the other. But instead, their best thing to do would be to tell people a positive story about Joe Biden, so that people who might be on the fence can feel more comfortable and have a better idea of what he stands for. But meanwhile, it showed that for the Trump campaign, they're actually better off doing negative ads about Biden because, again, people have such ingrained opinions about President Trump at this point that the best campaign strategy for the Trump campaign is not to make more people like Trump, it's to make more people dislike Joe Biden. So, different campaigns have different incentives. If that study winds up being something that the campaigns find credible, you're going to see a lot of negative ads run by the Trump folks about Joe Biden. And you're going to see a lot of positive ads run about Joe Biden by the Biden campaign. But the last thing that I'll note, though, is that, during the Super Bowl, our biggest sporting event here in the U.S., the campaigns sort of put different ads on TV. You had Mike Bloomberg putting an ad on TV. He's the billionaire who ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic nominee. And you had the Trump campaign put an ad on as well. It's notoriously the most expensive advertising time you can buy on television because millions upon millions of Americans are all watching. And in that moment, the Trump campaign used their time not to air a negative ad about Democrats or say anything negative at all, but instead to talk about things that President Trump had done regarding criminal justice reform, an issue that has now become very important and front and center here in the US. He talked about reforms he had made that would allow nonviolent folks who had committed nonviolent crimes to get out of prison faster rather than having these very long prison sentences. So he used that opportunity to tell a positive story about something he had done. I still think we're going to see a lot of negative ads on TV here in the US, and I'm not sure how the pandemic will change that. But if it does force campaigns to have to be pickier about the ad time, the ads that they're spending, I would not be surprised if you see the Biden campaign prioritizing a little bit more those positive ads about Biden, even as the Trump campaign prioritizes negative ads about Biden.
Okay, and the next question is from Giulielmo Ferranzano. I hope I said that correctly. And he asks, with regards to, first off, he's from the School of Journalism in Salerno, which is here in the South. Due to the information overload on the internet, are more millennials more likely to change their political opinion very quickly, or if they've already made up their minds in spite of information on the internet, would they change their minds?
So this is a great question, and there's actually a lot of evidence from even before the social media era that young people's political attitudes are more prone to change than older people's attitudes. Part of that is because if you are older, you have a long history of voting a certain way, of holding a certain set of views, and you're less likely to change those views. Where if you're younger, you have less of a track record of doing so, and you're still forming your worldview. There's some really exciting research that took a look at people's political attitudes over the course of their lifetime and found that things that people see, do, and encounter between the ages of 14 and 24 have significantly more of an impact on their lifetime political attitudes than things that happen after the age of 40. This is why you see, setting politics aside for the moment, so many consumer brands advertise very specifically to young people. It's not necessarily because young people have the most money to spend, but it's because they want to win over young people to bring that brand loyalty in place when they are younger and still forming their views. So I think you do see young people are still forming their views and are therefore, I think, very highly persuaded by things that they see on social media. I think a danger of this, though, is that social media allows you to really only see one side of the story, or if something winds up not being accurate, it's easier to you never see the correction. So an example of this, I would say, was there's an issue in the US called net neutrality, where there was, it is a pretty technical debate about how the government should regulate the internet and the companies that provide internet to people's homes. And there was a lot of outrage and anger among millennials on the internet about a decision that had been made by the government regulators that handle the issue. And there was a lot of stuff written about how this was going to mean the internet would no longer work functionally in the US, how you might have to pay money for every post you make on social media, and that this was going to be a terrible outrage. Pardon me. That this was going to be a terrible outrage. And then the policy went into place and none of those bad things wound up happening. But you never saw on social media anyone come back and post, hey, that wasn't so bad. Because what social media does is it encourages you to post things that make you feel strong emotions, whether that's happy, you think something's funny, or it's anger, frustration. How can this possibly be true? So things that are not always correct can still nonetheless wind up getting spread on social media very quickly and change people's minds when the thing that's actually correct, if it doesn't cause outrage or it doesn't seem that interesting, that doesn't wind up spreading as much. So it does make me nervous. I'm very glad that so many young people are getting engaged in politics and that they're using social media to do so. But I think we also have to be very aware of the ways that social media can be misused to selectively edit videos, to only post those things that are going to make people feel outraged, but that don't actually tell the complete picture, and that it winds up leading to people feeling more and more frustrated, dug in on certain issues, rather than taking a step back and thinking about things in a more nuanced way.
Okay, we have a question from Giulio Piloto, who's also from the University of Bologna. And his question is, in the near future, how political parties could prevent disasters as we saw as recent as the caucus in Iowa, where some of those, you're very familiar, where the online thing happened.
Yes. So I was in Iowa the night of the caucus. I had gone out there because I'm a contributor to a news channel and was going to be on air talking about the results. I work in the world of political data. It's very hard to go on television and talk when there's no data to talk about. So, the Iowa experience was scary in part because what was happening there was a state trying to move into the 21st century and use technology more effectively, but not being prepared fully to do so. And I think it really, for me, underscored the importance of finding ways to integrate technology into what we do, but be erring on the side of moving more slowly to make sure we get it right, rather than jumping too fast into something that where we don't know what the implications fully are, and we might not be able to sort of put things back into the bottle. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that for something like what happened in Iowa, that one is run by the Democratic Party of Iowa. So there's not a lot that the national parties could do on that front. We have this very unusual system in all sorts of ways where some things are controlled at the national level, but some things are run at the state level or even run at the county level. And so we tend in the US to have this instinct to say, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's let different counties and states experiment with different things, and we'll see what works and what doesn't. What happened in Iowa clearly was an example of something not working, but you immediately then had states like Nevada and other states that had Democratic caucuses coming up immediately go, whoa, what happened in Iowa was bad. Let's stop and let's make sure that that's not going to happen for us. And so while on the downside, a lot of different experiments means you're going to have some go wrong, the good news is that you can learn lessons from those and try to correct them in the future. And my hope is that those lessons have been learned and things have been corrected. What worries me more now is for the upcoming November election, we know that these in-person polling places are going to struggle because they're either going to be trying to use new software, they're going to be trying to keep people socially distanced. It might be hard to get people who are comfortable volunteering to work at those polling places. And that's fueled a lot of what we've seen in terms of these election disasters here in the US in the last couple of weeks, where folks have tried to go out and vote and have run into big problems. I'm hopeful that in the next couple of months, states will be able to put in place better systems so that we don't have a mess. But it would not surprise me if we have election night here in the US. Typically, you'd tune in, you would watch television as the votes come in from states. If we have a lot more mail-in voting and we have a lot of polling places where things are not going very smoothly, it would not surprise me if we do not know who the next president of the United States is on election night here in the US, because you're still trying to adapt to counting votes in new ways.
Okay, and we have a couple of questions, both from Daniela Herrera, who's at the University of Catania in Sicily, as well as Chiara Bascietto from Core University in Enna. Daniela asks about climate change, which obviously had been at the forefront of previous elections, and how much that will be impacting the current election. And Chiara asks about, of course, the very recent that you even mentioned in your slideshow, but we've also seen in the past couple of weeks protests here related to the Black Lives Matter movement. So how will these both overarching issues such as climate change, as well as more recent issues that have come to the forefront, impact elections?
It's a great question. I think that in terms of climate change was a very important issue primarily within the Democratic primary. That typically Republicans don't talk about it as much. It's not an issue that their voters are as focused on. And it's really an issue that young voters tend to be more focused on than older voters. And in primary elections, it tends to be an older electorate that turns out. So while young activists in the US tend to be extremely focused on climate change, it winds up not getting as much coverage at the national level. It would surprise me if there was more than one question on it asked in any presidential debates this coming year. It came up occasionally in the Democratic primary again, but the big issues that we have in the US that I think are going to drive this election more are healthcare, the economy, and I think Republicans are going to talk a lot about the issue of how we deal with China. So healthcare has been a big issue because healthcare is very expensive in the United States. Not everyone has access to it. There were reforms put into place during President Obama's presidency, but there's still an argument that they have not made things much better or that they have made things worse. Some folks don't really like it, and so this remains a point of debate. And so healthcare became a huge issue in the Democratic primary as they debated, should we move toward a system where the government provides healthcare for everyone and it's paid for by taxpayers? This was a huge part of the Democratic debate. And I think because COVID-19 has put a health issue so front and center, you're going to see that continue to get talked about a lot. The economy is another issue that actually had faded in importance prior to COVID-19. The economy in the US had been doing very well. Folks were sort of happy with it. Even if you didn't like President Trump, you thought the economy was doing okay. And so when things are going well, they tend not to be talked about in politics that much. But now, as a result of COVID-19, you saw millions of Americans filing for unemployment. The unemployment rate is at historic highs. And the question is, will we be able to come back out of this? Is this just a temporary pause, or is the economy going to get better? Or is it going to stay worse through November? I expect that to be a huge defining issue. And then China is something that I think Republicans are going to want to talk about a lot. In the same way that Democrats will talk about healthcare, Republicans will talk about China because increasing skepticism of China has been rising in the US even before COVID-19 among both Republicans and Democrats. You had Donald Trump talk a lot about it when he first ran, changing our trade policies toward them. And now with the story that the virus had originated in China and it has now put life on hold across the planet, this is something that I expect Republicans to talk a lot more about. And you've seen a lot of legislation come out of our Congress in the last few weeks, doing things like cracking down on Chinese companies on our stock exchanges, things like pushing to keep Chinese telecom companies from having greater access to our markets. This is an issue that I think is a big issue now, and I would actually go so far as to say I think it will be a defining issue for the Republican primary in 2024. Regardless of whether Trump wins or loses, Republicans will have a primary election in 2024. They'll have to choose who their nominee is, and I think China is going to be a big piece of that. For the protests that we've seen in the issue of racial injustice, this is something that I also think is going to be taking a front seat, at least in the short term. And the short term matters a lot because it's when things like Joe Biden will be choosing who his running mate is. He's pledged to choose a woman to be his running mate. And now there's even greater pressure on him to choose someone who is an African-American woman to fully reflect the diversity of the country. And because Black voters are such an important piece of his coalition. The challenge will be, who does he choose? That some of his options, like Senator Kamala Harris, she has a record on things like criminal justice issues that's actually not in line with what the Black Lives Matter movement has been calling for. So even though she is an African-American woman, there are things in her record that would create potential problems for her with the Democratic base. So Joe Biden, will be choosing who his vice presidential nominee is. And I think this issue of racial justice and police brutality has really most dramatically shaped that race for him. But it's also causing many Republicans to take a step back and realize that it's not just African-American voters who are in the streets protesting, that many swing voters have really changed their opinions on issues about racial justice and policing in just the last couple of weeks. We've seen huge shifts in the polls. So I would expect there to be increasing pressure on Republicans to have to weigh in on this issue when normally it's not an issue that they would put front and center. It's been put front and center by events, by the protests, et cetera. And I think Republicans are going to have to respond.
Thank you. We had a lot of interest in particular on that. Because just sticking on that topic 1 second, there was also another specific question just with regards to polling and things like that. Do you see the polling changing? We've seen some news already about some of the polling from the recent protests impacting particularly the Republican Party. There were a few questions with regards to that. If you had any specific comments, they were,
Sure.
I think, from the University of Bologna and a few others.
Absolutely. So before COVID-19 and before these protests here in the US, the race for president was somewhat close, but favored Joe Biden a little bit. He was slightly ahead coming out of the impeachment trial of President Trump. Trump had gotten more support from his own base, and it looked like it was going to be a closely fought race, though, with Biden slightly in the lead. When COVID-19 began, there was a brief moment early on in the crisis when a lot of voters who may not have liked President Trump all along nonetheless gave him the benefit of the doubt, and his job approval rating went up to some of the highest ratings it had been at during the course of his presidency. But as the crisis went on, and as people got more and more frustrated with the handling of it, with a sense that America wasn't getting any closer to doing the sorts of contact tracing and testing that would be needed to reopen, as well as the president's press conferences day in and day out had sometimes sent mixed messages or created more conflict than was needed, as well as the economic devastation that we were seeing from the response. People began to sort of fall out of love with President Trump's response to COVID-19. And by the time you got to May, his numbers were in tougher shape. However, the question was that Joe Biden had sort of disappeared, that he, because you couldn't go out and have these rallies, he wasn't face to face with his campaign staff. He wasn't saying as much. He was sort of letting President Trump be in the lead, be out there talking about the issue. And that has changed as of the time of these protests, that Joe Biden is now getting more and more out there talking about this issue because I think he understands how important it's going to be to so many voters. Meanwhile, I think when it comes to these protests, part of what is going to drive the polls, what is driving more and more voters toward Joe Biden and away from Donald Trump, is that while there are a lot of views that in this debate seem to be fairly extreme and not embraced by that many people. So for instance, you have some very progressive activists who say they want to get rid of the chaotic and it doesn't feel like leadership. And we need someone who's going to be a little more calmer and a little more level-headed. And so I think that's why in this moment when so many people are looking to their leaders, at the beginning of the crisis that favored President Trump, his response was good and swing voters were giving him the benefit of the doubt. But that has changed. And now a lot of voters may be saying, I just want someone who's going to keep the ship steady rather than make it more chaotic. And that dynamic is favoring Joe Biden.
Switching from issues at the moment, there is a question in from Francesco at the University of Milan, and he asks about, talked about how big media used to play a very significant role, and also for journalists. And his question is, how will the storytelling aspect of things change as we come out of the emergency period, but also because a couple of people have commented how television really is not the medium that young voters turn to for information. And so how will these factors impact the storytelling aspect of political campaigns?
That's a great question, because I think storytelling is one of the ways that you can do the best at persuading people, that going in and throwing numbers at people rarely changes minds, but telling compelling stories can change hearts. And so typically for instance, the political conventions, candidates would use those as opportunities to do storytelling. They would put together videos that would tell very movingly about a candidate's life, et cetera, to tell about their values and the things that they had done in office. And so now you're not going to have a big arena to show that video, but in some ways that type of video might be more important than ever because of the absence of other ways to tell those stories, because of the absence of things like rallies, et cetera. I think that though, a lot of that storytelling, the reliance on outside journalists to do that, I think is diminished, because I think both parties now have increasing distrust of media sources. You have a lot of progressive Democrats who think that the media got it wrong in the 2016 election because they focused too much on Hillary Clinton's emails. And conservatives in the US have always had a great deal of skepticism for traditional media outlets, feeling like they're not fair to them or that they don't cover things effectively. So that's why you've seen things like the Trump and Biden campaigns beginning to do more and more media production in-house, putting together those stories and those videos and sharing them out more widely. I do, though, think that we shouldn't dismiss the importance of TV advertising, in part because while younger voters may not be watching a lot of TV, they still do watch those live TV sporting events. That's one of the few things that you can't just watch on streaming, even though there are some things that are allowed to be streamed. So that live TV, if that comes back, that'll remain very important. And in this election, and I focus on young voters all the time, and I think they're incredibly important, but actually one of the most important swing voter groups in this election that I'm seeing right now are senior citizens. So typically in the last couple of elections, Democrats have done well with younger voters and Republicans have done well with older voters. But during the month of April and May, if you looked at polls here in the United States, Joe Biden was doing very well among the oldest voters. Now, whether that was because older voters were the most susceptible to COVID-19 and were disapproving of the way President Trump was handling things, whether who knows? There could be any number of things that were causing it, but it was happening a lot in a bunch of different polls, and it was part of what was dragging Trump's numbers down. So if that's the case, if senior citizens wind up being a very important swing coalition in this election, then I think TV advertising is going to remain important because so many seniors still will turn on a channel like Fox News, where I'm a contributor, and leave it on during the day in their homes. They'll watch the network news at night, or they'll still watch the local news. That still really matters, especially to senior citizens who are, I think, going to be a very critical group in this coming election.
So we've had a few people who, one in particular, an American citizen who's studying here in Italy, who had asked about the voting process, which of course for us is an absentee ballot process, which you had touched upon. Each state is different, but voting by mail is going to be potentially increased this time. But how does that affect other current issues? There were some comments by somebody with regards to, the discussions in recent years with regards to the LGBTQIA community and how, sometimes that can be impacted, particularly with the voting by mail or other minority groups. And if you had any comments with regards to that.
Sure. So one of the big controversies right now around something like increasing vote by mail is that there are some Republicans who believe that if you switch to vote by mail, it will increase, it will help the other party, that it will help Democrats or it will help progressive causes. And there's actually not a lot of evidence that that is the case. There have been a number of studies that have been done in places comparing both before and after they adopted vote by mail, and they don't find there to be a dramatic effect one way or another. They also tend to find that voting by mail, the groups that particularly start to gravitate toward voting by mail, I believe it was senior citizens, rather than it becoming a thing that is engaging more young people to vote, that instead it winds up being something that your most reliable voters, who tend to be older, them just opting into a new way of participating. I am skeptical of claims that I hear from Republicans that they worry, if we move to vote by mail, is that suddenly going to mean Democrats are doing better? Is it going to increase voter fraud? There's not a lot of evidence for that. And you even have some states like Colorado, for instance, was a state where they switched to mail-in voting. And when that happened, Republicans actually did quite well in the election that followed that. There are some states like my home state of Florida, where for years and years, mail-in and absentee balloting has been a big piece of the process. And so the state parties there, Republican and Democrat, have gotten very good at figuring out how to activate voters along those lines. I do think, though, that the challenge is going to be that voting by mail means that votes get counted over a longer and longer period of time. And so you see in California, for instance, elections where on election night it looks like one person won, and then 3 or 4 days later, they finally are getting closer to counting all of the ballots, and the result seems to flip. And I think the unfortunate reality is that that sows distrust, that voters go, well, wait a minute, on election night, you told me one person was winning, and now you're telling me somebody else is winning. Was there any funny business? Was there fraud? What was going on there? You are going to see, I worry that you are going to see a lot of that type of conversation, because if we switch to more vote by mail, the odds that we will know on election night who won goes down, which leads to more and more opportunities for folks to say, well, wait a minute, those people were going around and trying to pick up people's ballots at their house, and they weren't handing them in. Or, again, instances of voter fraud are extremely rare here in the US. But allegations of voter fraud and allegations of voter suppression, et cetera, those are things that I think are going to lead to a very, very, very tough moment for our country as these ballots are getting counted, because people are used to knowing on election night who won. And I think this time around they may not. And I think that's going to cause some real strife.
Okay, sadly, we're coming to the end of our time here, but Kristen, do you have time for one last question?
Sure, one last question. Let's do it.
Great. So we have a number of folks, Francesco, Chiara, and others, who were asking about this concept that you had mentioned and touched upon in our discussion with regards to fake news and conspiracy theories, which are rampant on the internet and social media activities. And so how will this either impact how campaigns are using this, or how should young voters try to perceive this and work against it, or better inform themselves?
So, my advice to young voters, whenever I get to talk to them about things like misinformation on the internet, is to encourage people to always take a step back and think about what kind of emotion is this tweet or this post trying to invoke in me. And realize that most of these social media platforms, they privilege content that creates strong emotions in people. It makes you angry, it makes you frustrated, it makes you happy, whatever that emotion is. Things that make you feel tend to take priority over things that make you think. And so I always encourage people, if something looks too good to be true, if it aligns exactly with what you believe and it pushes exactly the right emotional buttons to outrage you, that's exactly the moment when you should take a step back and go, wait a minute, is this the whole picture? Because social media, it makes it so easy for us just to see the piece of the picture that we want to see. So for instance, during these protests over the last couple of weeks, if you primarily were on conservative social media, the main things you may have seen were clips of stores getting broken into by protesters, of protesters spray painting on statues and things like that. And it might outrage you. It might push those buttons and you go, look at this lawless behavior. This is terrible and it needs to be stopped. Meanwhile, if you are more progressive, you are probably not seeing any of those videos. Those are not the sorts of things that the folks you follow want to share. It doesn't follow their narrative. What you will want to see is people who are standing up and fighting for justice. You will want to see the folks who are holding the good signs, who are going out and making their point of view known. So conservatives will never see the good stuff, and the progressives might see less of the bad stuff. And so everyone gets a different picture of what's going on. So I encourage people, if something is making you think what you already thought, if it's just reinforcing a belief you already have, realize you may be seeing something that's distorted, that is coming through a lens that wants to make you feel good and like you are right. But that's exactly the moment you should take a step back and go, what am I missing here? How can I go listen to a voice that's different than the one I normally listen to make sure that I'm getting the complete picture?
Okay, Kristen, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody out there in our audience across all of Italy. We appreciate all of you joining us and for all of your great questions. And for those of you who, please tell your friends. We will post this on the YouTube channel so that people who could not join us for the live program can see it at another time. Kristen, over to you for any final words. Thanks.
Oh, I'm just so grateful for you all for inviting me to be a part of this. You know, this election it's a couple months away, which feels very close, but is also an eternity in politics. As I mentioned at the beginning, 1 week we're focused entirely on COVID, and the next week an entirely new issue has come to the fore and is reshaping our political conversation here in the US. So we still got a long way to go to November, but I hope you'll continue paying attention and following what we're doing here in our American elections, because it's going to be quite an interesting ride.